It's my pleasure to turn today over to our president, Dr. Fowles, who I thank greatly for his service in this extended term and these challenging times. Dr. Fowles, thank you.
Well, thank you, Terry. I appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to our annual meeting. It'd be nice to be in person, but here we are. And, you know, it's not so bad, actually. We had our meetings last night, business meeting and some awards, and it turned out quite well. So, Terry, thanks a lot for putting it all together. And, you know, this has been a very trying period. You know, who would have thought a year ago that we'd be doing this at this time, but we are. And, you know, and even having said that, there's been some good things that have come out of it. So, you know, real resilience and adaptability have been our key words for this time. And we've, you know, rather than, you know, get too worried about it or just, you know, give up, I think everyone in our society has really made a decision to work together and try to make things better for not just us, but our community as well. And I think that's probably one of the real positive things that's come out of this is just the awareness of, you know, how important what we do is. It's not just all about us at all. It's about the people we serve, but we do bring something to the table. And I really thank you all for doing what you do every day to make other lives better. We hope you've all been doing well and surviving all of this. And we want to thank you for your continued support for the annual meeting on this virtual platform. We are certainly grateful to the sponsors who stayed with us. Several did actually, and really did pitch in. And we do hope that you'll take some time to visit the virtual exhibit hall during our breaks throughout the day. I want to thank you to everyone here that has contributed to make this annual meeting possible. The planning, the presenting, the attending. There are a lot of, you know, in previous years, I had, you know, when I wasn't president, I knew there was work involved. I had no idea how much. And I knew Terry did a lot, but I've come to realize just how much. So, and other people too. So we definitely thank you all. And honestly, it's great to come together. Delighted to celebrate this opportunity to gather for, you know, education, for connecting with each other. And, you know, it really is a good opportunity for us. On a more personal note, I really am looking forward to the speakers today. We've got an excellent cast. I think you'll learn a lot. I think you'll enjoy it too. This is when I saw the cast, you know, some of these things, honestly, sometimes you come to these and you're kind of dreading it. And you're like, oh my God, do I really have to do this? But today's slate is really superb. And I'm inspired. And, you know, my whole thing in conferences over the years is I go to network, not to go to the sessions. So in full disclosure, but this one, I'm actually going to watch the sessions. And I think we've got a great slate. A couple of friends are going to join us too this afternoon, Lloyd Setter and Joe Parks. And I think they'll have some great things to say. But, you know, so without further ado, we want to thank the Arizona Society for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry for their contribution. They've always, you know, been great partners, good collaborators. And the first speaker this morning is supported by them. And I invite Dr. Ranjabar to make the introductions, and who is also the president of ASCAP. And really glad you're here with us today, and take it ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Fowles, and good morning, everyone. My name is Nusheen Ranjbar. I have been serving as the president for ASCAP, and Dr. Suzanne Dawn will be taking that role over the next year. And I am delighted to be presenting my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Sidhu. as he will be sharing with us an exceptional presentation. I have seen his work and heard his work many times. So Dr. Sidhu is currently the program director for the University of California, San Diego Medical Center, Rady Children's Hospital, Child Psychiatry Fellowship Program. He is also Distinguished Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, as well as the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. He has provided mental health evaluations for asylum-seeking immigrants, both in detention centers and in the community for the past many years. He has evaluated transgender women, children, and families. He has also served as an expert witness in federal immigration court and has testified to the United States Senate Committee on Healthcare, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the HELP Committee. He has also written op-ed pieces, provided interviews for local news and podcasts, and worked with local congressional representatives on this issue of asylum. In addition, Dr. Sidhu has developed a training model for border communities in the Southwest. The model trains mental health providers and primary care providers in how to provide forensic mental health evaluations for asylum-seeking immigrants who are fleeing torture and persecution from their respective countries. He and his colleagues have been able to train 525 providers across the southwestern United States over the past 2 years using this model. I'm glad to say that I was the very fortunate recipient of one of these trainings. And here in Arizona, we've had Dr. Sidhu several times come down and train many of our medical students, psychiatry residents, fellows, faculty, and community providers in this work. And it has been truly transformative for me personally and professionally. So with that, I am so happy to have him with us. Welcome, Dr. Sidhu, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you so much. And do we wait till 9 or do we just roll with it at this point?
Just roll with it.
Just roll with it. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Nosheen. I feel like you're sort of a soul sister in so many ways, and you could easily be my mentor as well. So I think we're all working hard. Everyone who's attending today is working hard, you know, and you're all experts in your own right. And so we're just doing what we can with situations that are put in front of us and hoping for the best. So thank you so much for that introduction. Let me see if I can share my slides here, and then I'll have to get confirmation from people that they can see them. Okay.
Yes, we can see them.
You can see them. Okay. I'm going to minimize my window, so I won't really be able to see you all, but just let me know if you can't hear me or you can't see me. I can also kind of come over here and, yeah, I think, never mind. Let's see. I was gonna just make sure that my mic is turned up all the way, unless you can hear me super clearly.
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, then forget it. But yeah, so today we will be talking about a broad range of kids, but the common theme is that they're all immigrant children. And so the topic is psychosocial adversity in child immigrants and their families. But, you know, just in terms of giving you a little bit of the lay of the land, I'll be talking for about an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. But go ahead and please feel free to type into the chat box as we go along any comments, thoughts, or questions that you have, maybe any cases that you've had. And then we can, if I notice it while I'm talking, I can just stop and answer it. And if I don't, then we can have some questions to answer at the end. And so it could really be sort of more of an open dialogue. My disclosures are that I work at the University of California, San Diego, and Rady Children's Hospital. And they pay my salary and they pay some of my traveling fees. And then I also do work with the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And I've received grants from them. It says research, but most of those have actually been grants for asylum type work. And They also have paid for some travel and a small honorarium for a course that I do for them. And recently, I probably should add the APA here. I'm on a council for the APA that will pay for travel, but because of COVID this year, we haven't traveled anywhere. So I've yet to really utilize that, but I do also sit on a council. There's no like pharmaceutical interest or anything. So we start with this basic premise that everyone can do something. And when you're thinking about a huge system like immigration, you might be very overwhelmed, right? Just maybe like Mother Teresa was when she was looking at millions and millions of orphans in Calcutta. We don't have to necessarily become Mother Teresa in order to make a difference. And chances are the work that you're actually doing right now can help immigrant families with very, very little additional effort. And we'll kind of get to that. And so that's what I'm interested in, is sort of what next steps would you be willing to take? And we can help you. I have mentorship relationships with people in multiple states. So does Nosheen. And we're constantly interfacing with people who want that support, and we're happy to give it, on our own time. It's a small community, but it's important work. So what we'll talk about today is the scope of the refugee crisis, but then also talk about psychosocial adversities in child immigrant populations, and apply information to the clinical care of child immigrant populations. And then explore areas where you can actually get involved. Like, how can you actually use the information that you received today to change the way that you practice? So I'm going to try to go pretty quickly because it's a lot of information, but feel free to raise your hand, like through Zoom, or let me know if I'm going too fast or something's unclear. So we can sort of superficially separate these child populations into two groups. One is a group that has mostly for their life lived outside of the United States, and some circumstances have caused them to flee their country of origin, usually torture, persecution, armed conflict, domestic violence, things of that nature. Gang, police, military, other types of situations. And so they often come from all over the world, and they're seeking sort of shelter here. The other group of kids is the group that may have either been born in the United States, or for this group, if you're a dreamer, you came to the United States very early on, and you're probably living with at least one undocumented parent. A lot of times these folks have come from Mexico or Central America, but definitely not always. So again, that's why I said there's a little bit of a superficial distinction. Some folks do come for economic reasons, and other folks come because they're fleeing torture and persecution. And that's sort of, rather than making assumptions, we just ask when we're working with these populations. And so as you can see, there's a huge overlap. I kind of posed it in such a sort of dialectical black and white way because the research is usually with one group or the other, but in truth, there's a lot of overlap. And so we have our first multiple choice question. I want you to type into the chat box what you think the answer is. So you could type in A, B, C, D, or E. Which form of humanitarian relief applies to immigrants who can demonstrate torture and/or persecution on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group, and when the torture or persecution occurred in their country of origin by the government, military, police entities, gangs? Would that be green card, political asylum, T visa, U visa, or Violence Against Women Act? So I'm looking in the chat box. I'm seeing a lot of B's. You guys are on it this morning. You had your coffee. Or if you're Nosheen, you probably had your wheatgrass juice because she's healthy. But you're right, the answer is B. So you guys are very smart. And so the other forms, though, just for your information, because I hadn't heard of these when I first started doing this work. The other forms are, well, green card, as you know, is just sort of your way of getting immigration. But T visa is important. That's for victims of sex trafficking, particularly if they were trafficked in the United States for labor or sexual, actually, any form of trafficking. And a U visa is a visa that someone can get if they were, let's say you're undocumented and you have a crime committed against you in the United States. You can also apply for that form of humanitarian relief. And then VAWA, or Violence Against Women Act, is what it sounds like. So if you have to be married, that's the trick about VAWA. It can't just be a dating relationship. But if you're married to a US citizen and you're undocumented, and that US citizen is domestically violent against you, you can apply for citizenship through this kind of this process. So there are a number of different ways that attorneys can help immigrants who have been victims of crimes, and it's helpful to know that. But if you work with an attorney, they'll tell you what they want you to kind of focus on. So this is a very dizzying slide. We don't need to kind of spend too much time on it because it's a lot of information. I think one kind of broader picture is, I mean, if this is hard for you to understand, can you imagine if you never went to school and you don't speak the language? It would be hard, right? But the ways that people typically get to this country, the best way for the person, for the refugee, is to apply from outside of the United States and be accepted from the U.S. Department of State or United Nations or Department of Homeland Security. And if you're one of the few lucky people who get your application accepted, you actually get welcomed into the country with open arms and a resettlement package. It's very few people. And there's a strange rule that if you're from Honduras and you want to apply for asylum in the United States, you actually cannot apply from Honduras. You have to go to another country and then apply. So there are these kind of strange idiosyncrasies with the law. Option B is the affirmative process. So you come to the United States on a valid visa, whatever kind of visa that is. And when you're here, you say, I want to apply for asylum. C is probably what the vast majority of people do, which is they come to the border. And then you see there, it says transported to immigration detention center. And so the strange thing here is these folks haven't done anything wrong. They haven't committed a crime. They're actually doing what we want them to do. You know, they're not crossing the border without permission. They're coming and they're being totally upfront and honest. But there's still this mandatory detention. There's the credible fear interview. If you pass that, which is pretty hard, then you go on to the evaluation with the judge. And if you pass that, which is pretty hard, then you get asylum. At any point there, you could be transferred from facility to facility. You could be separated from your family. And you could be deported at any point. And then defensive asylum is sort of that if you were here without permission and you were caught, which, you know, it could just be that you ran a traffic light, you know, and you get pulled over and they discover that you're not documented. It could be as simple as that. Then you usually are on a fast track for deportation, but technically even then you have the right to apply for asylum. I would say very, very small percentage of those folks know that, and they're probably not told. One article that I read that is not in this presentation is that about 50% of people are not even informed of their right to apply. A good number of them are not given these forms in their native language, so they don't even know what's happening. Some feel pressured to sign something that they don't understand, which is often sort of something that causes them to be deported. So there are a lot of issues with the system, as you can imagine. So why does this topic matter to child psychiatrists, I guess, or adult psychiatrists for that matter? Well, as a percentage of the population, immigrants have nearly, tripled. And so the likelihood of us coming across immigrants in our clinical care is much higher now than it was, several decades ago. And the percent of kids now classified as first or second generation immigrants has gone in a much shorter time span, has gone from 17.5% to a quarter of kids. So, I mean, even if you're adult psychiatrists and you see 18-year-olds, if a quarter of the people that you see are a first or second generation immigrant, some of these issues are going to matter even in just prescribing fluoxetine for depression. And there are a lot of kids right now who would meet this definition. So almost 5 million children have at least one undocumented parent. And the vast majority of these kids were born in the United States, even if they have one undocumented parent. And then this statistic kind of tells us about the longitudinal nature. So 7 to 9% of all kids born in the US between 2003 and 2014 had at least one undocumented parent. So you think about this whole country, How many kids were born between 2003 and 2014? A lot of kids, right? If almost 10% of them had a one undocumented parent, it's a lot of kids that we're going to be coming across with an undocumented parent. And so immigrants in general experience more discrimination and bullying, and that's why they may be presenting to you. So immigrant children, regardless of background, whether you're a refugee or a dreamer or somebody who came and your family's in a perfectly quote unquote legal situation, you're still going to be more likely to experience discrimination and have lower educational, psychological, and social outcomes compared to your peers. The specific stressors that immigrant children report are difficulty communicating with their friends. We know how important social relationships are. Negative perceptions of their parents' home country. So they start to go through this identity formation, and this chasm can develop psychodynamically where they don't necessarily have a sense of like, what is my identity? Financial struggles at home and loss of supportive school networks. So you really end up in this place of isolation because you feel like you can't connect with your parents and you can't connect with your friends. And that's why these kids are high risk. So stress relations with parents and community violence as well. So this first set of slides, this talk is kind of divided in two. This is now just talking about asylees and refugees. So if you go back to that first diagram that split them in two, these are just the kids that are born outside of the US and are fleeing some sort of conflict, torture, persecution, and that's why they're coming to our borders. I think this picture really documents how just fragmenting it must be to be, it's something you probably don't understand unless you go through it. And so I think this does a good job of helping us try. There's just so much going through your mind, which is probably down in that kind of sort of reptilian brain of just survival and fight and flight, that the higher cognitive processes are probably tough to access at that point. And we see that when we talk with folks. They can be, dissociating and hard for them to really kind of be with us as we talk. So the next multiple choice question, get out your virtual number 2 pencil, I guess. What is the current status of people displaced by persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations? So what are the numbers looking like? Are we doing better now in terms of global displacement after the Iraq and Afghanistan wars? Are we doing worse overall, but not as bad as World War II? Is this time seeing the worst ever numbers since World War II? Are we sort of stable and steady? Or is there insufficient data to answer this question? Let me check my trusty chat box. We're seeing a little bit more kind of heterogeneity in this answer, which it makes a lot of sense because, we're not all historians. But the correct answer is C, worst ever since World War II. And so if you look here, we're at about 67 million people worldwide who have been displaced from their homes due to persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations. When you compare that, it's about 47 million post World War II. And you think about all the areas of the world that were involved in World War II. You've got Northern Africa, you've got Asia, United States, all of Europe pretty much, Russia, like huge parts of the world. We have exceeded that now. And I think we just don't really, information overload, we just don't really know. We don't really get and understand that we're at those levels. And a lot of these folks who are displaced are women and children. So the myth that it's all, hardened gang members who are trying to cross is a myth. So by the time we're done with this talk, unfortunately, thousands of people will have had to flee. So that's kind of a humbling statistic. So this goes to show 10 million child refugees worldwide, a lot of kids. And from 2010 to 2016, we saw a 450% increase in unaccompanied minors. So many of you may be parents. If you're not a parent, you may have like nieces and nephews or even pets, let's say. How bad would things have to be for you to send one of your only children on a trip hundreds of miles long with a complete stranger and knowing that they probably will face trauma on the way, whether it's sexual assault, they could be trafficked, anything, for the hope of a potential better life. I shared the story that one time we were at this big state fair and we lost my son for 10 minutes. And those were the longest 10 minutes of my life. I mean, our whole family is still, we still have dreams about it because we were so panicked in those 10 minutes. And if I had a hard time for 10 minutes, what would it be like for him to be out of our grasp and for us to not know what's happening to him for months or years? I mean, I can't even imagine that. It would be really hard. So things would have to be pretty bad for me to do that. I would have to feel pretty powerless. So there's a notion here, well, they're just sending their kids here to be an anchor baby or for economic, advancement. But I don't know, it would be hard for me to send my child knowing that they would be traumatized potentially on the way for purely economic reasons. So it's in Syria, we're up to 11 million people who have been displaced in the country. The war is still ongoing. We're throwing out these numbers with so many millions, it's hard to understand. This is Los Angeles. And so to get to 11 million people, you'd have to displace the entire city 3 times. So imagine in your mind, if you took the whole city of Los Angeles and made it like disappear once, twice, and then a 3rd time. Or if you imagine in your mind how many people that would be on the freeways exiting at the same time, it's a lot of people. So next question, take out your virtual pencil. The homicide rate per capita is highest in which of the following areas of the world? The African Great Lakes, Brazil, Myanmar, Syria, or the Northern Triangle of Central America? Let's see what people say. Getting some mixed answers here, which again is understandable because I picked a lot of places that have had conflict. So, and so they're, they could probably stand to have help everywhere. But the answer is actually the Northern Triangle of Central America. And so according to a 2014 study, the gangs and cartel members outnumber police in El Salvador and Honduras. And so the murder rate is 1st, 4th, and 5th in this part of the world. I can only imagine if my kids were like, if this was their walk to school and this was what they were having to see on a daily basis. And so you can see here, the top 5, 3 of them are Central American countries. You have to go all the way down to 3rd from the bottom to get to the United States. And I don't particularly think of the United States as being, the safest place in the world, but this shows you the discrepancy. And so this compares some of our most kind of violent cities to some of the most violent Central American cities. And this compares Honduras to Iraq. And so when people say it's like a war zone in Central America, it's literally like a war zone or worse, based on homicide. Now, sometimes we forget, being in the United States, that, gay marriage was sort of passed by the Supreme Court just a few years ago. And there are a number of places in the world where you can receive the death penalty for having an LGBT status. So some of the people that Nosheen and I are evaluating are really, really at risk in their countries for persecution. And in Central America, what we're seeing, a lot of the transgender women that I've evaluated, it's not technically illegal to be transgender, but there is a quote unquote friendliness ranking, which basically means that if you're an LGBT minority in one of these countries, it's not illegal, but you will not be able to receive any protection, any meaningful protection from the police. And thus, a gang who is looking for exploitation is most likely to be a predator of that person. And so we've heard time and time again, story after story after story after story. If I went to the police, but they just laughed at me and made fun of me because there's a stigma, and there was basically no way for them to get any protection. So as a result, there's this again, this myth out there that people are only coming to the United States for asylum, but these are asylum requests made to Mexican authorities, and you can see even even for people applying to Mexico, the numbers have gone up. And again, dispelling the myth that it's only the United States, there's been a 2,000% increase in people trying to leave the Northern Triangle and go to any country they can. Belize, Costa Rica, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama. And so it's not that they're all just coming to the United States, they're fleeing to wherever they can. They can make it to the United States, great, but a lot of them go for the shortest solution because the violence has reached those levels. And so this is just to show that, you know, the number of asylums did peak, and then it does ebb and flow based on the season and based on who's in office. So the next question for your chat box is true or false? Border crossings are at an all-time high. Let's see what people think. Getting some falses in here, some trues. Okay, good mixture. So this is showing it broken down by administration. That there was this idea that, you know, when there was a transfer from the previous administration to the current administration, that all of a sudden there were less people crossing the border. But basically over time, it started to come up to where it was in the previous administration before anyways. And so it's really independent of that. And so the total number of border crossings is actually lower now than it was in 2000. Because if you look at 2000, it was higher, and 2019 it was lower. But it depends on how you split up the statistics, because someone could accurately say that the border crossings are higher than they've ever been in the last 10 years. You know, if you start at about 2010, you see that they're higher. So it just depends on how you split the statistics. Overall, it's not the highest period that we've ever seen. So which segment of the population crossing the border has dramatically increased in recent years? This is your next question. Go ahead and go into your trusty chat box and fire away. We're getting a lot of unaccompanied minors in there. Okay, so correct, unaccompanied minors have gone up drastically, and family units in particular have gone up drastically as well. This is just from the El Paso sector, not too far from you all. And so if you look at the family units on the, let's say on the left graph, you can see that really after 2017, there's been a really big increase. And then if you go and you look at the pink family units on the right, you can see about the same thing, that the pink has really increased. And so I think the summary of this information is that we're not, the total number of border crossings are the highest that they've been in the last 10 years, but lower than they were, you know, in 2000. But then specifically these unaccompanied minors, and even more so the family units, have gone up higher than they've ever been in history. So some statistics to sort through when you're hearing all this news. And as a result, we don't have enough immigration judges, and there's a huge backlog of nearly 2,000 cases per judge, which is why people just sit for months, sort of meaninglessly. Now getting to some mental health statistics. I'm just looking at my time. Immigrants who are fleeing torture and persecution have 2 times the rate of major depressive disorder, PTSD, and psychosis than non-immigrants, according to the World Health Organization. A study out of Germany showed that about 50% of refugees who were coming in were showing signs of mental illness, with 25% meeting full criteria for MDD, PTSD, or anxiety. This is a camp, Al-Zatri in Jordan, that started out with a few hundred refugees and has now expanded to 170,000 people living in one refugee camp. Some children have been born and raised in this, what has basically become a city. There are 2 documentaries, No Conflict of Interest, on Netflix. One is called, actually I can't remember the name now, but if you type in the Al-Zatri, the refugee camp, you'll see it. Salam Neighbor, that's the first one, Salam Neighbor. And then there was another one recently that came out that actually show what life is like in this camp, and it's quite interesting. Very sad, but it helps explain things. So now we'll talk about detention. This is right in New Mexico, pictures from the the Artesia Detention Center before it closed. You can see the crowding. Can you imagine with COVID? I mean, this would not be good. And some of these pictures are hard to believe that this is a first world country. Lead chip, paint chipping off the walls. Hopefully it doesn't have lead in it. These are the kids who sort of sleep, in there. There's another HBO film called Icebox that almost shoots this exact scene. And the temperatures are low and they're given these like tin foil sheets. So sometimes they'll actually huddle together to try to get the warmth. This is where I've done most of my work, which is in a detention center in New Mexico. It's called the Cibola Detention Facility. And so we wrote this paper and we looked at compiled data from 3 separate studies that showed mental illness rates in detention. And we were like floored by what we saw. These rates are astronomically high. Even if you took these rates and you said they seem to be too high and you reduced them by 50%, they would still be alarmingly high. So, and you can see they're separated by parents and children. So about almost 100% with, depression, a large number with PTSD. Parents are showing pretty much 100% anxiety. You can imagine if you were a parent in detention, you'd probably have anxiety, right? But some of the concerning statistics, as if those weren't concerning enough, 20% of parents reporting a psychotic disorder. So how well are they going to be able to regulate their child if their perception of reality is altered? And then suicidal ideation being quite high in the parents. And we've had the rates of suicide are much higher in detention than in the general population. Nooses have been found. There have been at least 8 documented deaths by suicide in detention. And so if you look at per 100,000, the rates in detention are far higher for completed suicide. And then as you go to the right here, we start seeing the fallout for children and developmental regression, which is very concerning. So enuresis, onchopresis, food refusal, language regression. It makes sense. If the parents are traumatized and or psychotic and or depressed and they're not getting treatment, they're not going to be able to parent their children. If they're not able to parent their children will regress. Now, I don't think the answer is to separate them from their children. That would probably make it worse. But the answer is probably to help these adults so that they can parent. And now we're going to shift totally to the next population. So in the beginning, all of what we've talked about, so far has been people who are coming to this country fleeing war and persecution. Now we're talking about the group of kids who probably came here when they were very young and have grown up with an undocumented parent. Some of them may have even been born here, and some were born outside of the United States, but the commonality is that they're living with an undocumented parent. So what are the psychosocial outcomes for kids who have an undocumented parent, even if they qualify for services here in the United States? So poverty. Undocumented immigrants are paid below minimum wage, increasing the risk for food insecurity, poor nutrition, and poor health in children. So again, the majority of these children were born in the United States. They came when they were very young, but more of them were born here. They should qualify for all kinds of services. But despite that, they still have this risk for food insecurity. And they're still, because their parents are ineligible for public assistance, like welfare, the fact that the kid is a citizen, it doesn't trickle down to them. And there's this real fear that if you hear this in the news this is not like imaginary. The current administration has challenged public charge several times. So what that means is if an immigrant takes any help from the system, Medicaid, educational, food stamps, whatever, that could disqualify them from being able to get a green card or immigration. When communities hear about this, it makes them not seek treatment. And we know what happens if you don't get treatment early on, it gets worse and worse and worse. Then we get an 18-year-old coming in with schizophrenia or with a really crystallized substance use disorder that is much harder to treat. And poverty is correlated with a lot of negative cognitive and emotional outcomes in low-income children. So they're at risk for poverty, but and that's the importance for things like, school lunches, at least they get one good meal. This is a nonprofit organization that is a workers' rights, kind of like Cesar Chavez type organization. And I just put some of their slides in here. You can see migrant workers really have no protections at work, and they're at risk of being injured on the job. And this talks about the minimum wage. Housing, I mean, this is what housing may look like in your neighborhood or not too far from it. And so if you're a kid who has a parent who's undocumented, your parent will not be eligible for housing assistance. So 40% of these farm worker households have more than multiple adults in each room, and lower rates of washers and dryers. So if we see this kid in our clinic and they look like, like disheveled, it may not necessarily be a fault of the parents if they don't even have access to a washer and dryer. So we may be thinking it's child abuse and neglect, and it may be, but the question is, that's often presumed that the parents have the resources and they're not using them. In this case, they may not have the resources in the first place. And impact on children. Crowding has been associated with academic issues, medical issues, behavioral problems. So this again is talking about decent housing. Now we'll talk about if you're born in the United States, you have all the same rights as anyone else, but you happen to have an undocumented parent. You have a higher overall risk of developmental issues, including issues with language development, health, social, and emotional domains. These studies in particular were working with Mexican families, but it could have been any real group that had come across. You could probably extrapolate. Lower reading and math skills at entry. And undocumented immigrants are less likely than other ethnic groups to send their children to preschool. So you might think to yourself, I would have thought to myself inaccurately that, well, they just don't value education. But here's the critical part of this next study, that the children of Mexican and Central American immigrants are far less likely to attend preschool despite a parental preference that their children attend. So what the total story here is that these parents would love to send their kids to preschool, but they can't find a way to. There could be, they don't have the transportation, they don't have the money, they are afraid of interacting with the system due to other kinds of consequences, and so the kids don't attend. And we know that preschool is especially important for low-income families and for cognitive development in little kids. Healthcare, that's what we do, right? So if you're the child of an undocumented immigrant, you're less likely to be covered by health insurance, and that's been an they've been covered at increasingly lower rates since 1996, so it's been getting progressively worse. And we know about lower rates of healthcare utilization and continuity of care, what that means. But also importantly, this goes to resources. Undocumented immigrants are less likely to be aware of their eligibility requirements. So even if their children were born here and thus they should have full access to healthcare, they're a citizen, those children are still not getting healthcare because their parents may not even be aware that they're allowed to apply, or if they know that they're allowed, they might be afraid of there being some reprimand to them doing so, consequence. We'll talk about workplace raids, which I'm sure you've heard about. Just in the last week, there was another message out of the current administration that they would be increasing raids. And so a study of 900 undocumented adults was completed, and they looked at these folks, what was the impact on the family for adults who were arrested at their workplace. So out of these 900 people, 500 of them had kids who were affected, and a lot of these kids were under 5 years of age. We all know the importance of the first 5 years, basically laying the foundation for all of life. And so for these families, the immediate effects of having one parent arrested at the workplace was loss of childcare, dramatic loss of income, reluctance to go to anyone for help, difficulty obtaining very basic needs, so food, diapers, formula, clothing. If the baby doesn't have formula, they will die, right? So this is not removing luxuries. These are like very, very, very basic items that people need to live. And so from the same study, they followed them for the weeks and months that followed. And the parents who did not get arrested, so let's say a father got, this is just an example, a father got arrested at work, then the mother reported, in the weeks and months that followed, that she was feeling socially isolated, she was feeling depressed, she was maybe even having suicidal ideation. And the children who now don't have that parent at home were reporting more anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And so I like showing this picture because it's a total perspective shift. If you just look at this picture, you see a lot of men. You see a lot of men who have colored skin in one form or another. They're looking down. You could easily imagine these are a bunch of criminals, right? But what you don't see is that each of them has a family. So imagine if standing next to each person, kind of horizontally in the picture, if their family was standing with them. It would create a very different image in your mind, right? And so I think the alternative way of looking at it helps me to understand that, when these folks are arrested, it's really the community is going through that experience of the arrest. I'm not saying nobody should ever be arrested, but I'm just saying we have to weigh the fact that it will have a consequence on their family and it will have a consequence on the community. And so, that's just one reality. So looking at deportation. So we went from workplace arrest to what does it do to children when their parents are just totally deported? And all of you have probably worked with either these families or children at some point. So parental deportation results in increased risk for the development of substance abuse, unemployment, and interpersonal difficulties with family members. So when that kid loses that parent, that kid is more likely to become someone who then uses substances, is unable to find meaningful work, and has trouble with relationships. Makes sense, right? You're removing a parent. 50% of kids of undocumented parents reported that they were directly affected by this. So it doesn't mean that 50% of kids, so remember we talked about how this was 5 million, right? So 50% is 2.5 million. That's a lot of children who are directly affected by deportation. It may not be that their parent was deported, but it may be that a friend's parent was deported or a community member was deported. And 30% of these kids were meeting criteria for depression. So these are kids who are having to say bye to their mom from the back of a police cruiser. This particular woman, her only crime was she had been checking in with immigration since she had come voluntarily. I think she missed one appointment with an immigration official, and that was all that it took. It's a famous case from Arizona. So when kids have a parent deported, they have more behavioral issues, sleep and appetite problems, excessive crying, fear, aggression, withdrawn behavior. Children who have a parental deportation report more stress. It's a major life trauma for them. And even when they're separated voluntarily, so what does that mean? It means if the children say, or the father or mother says, I'm gonna go just turn myself in or something, like if it's not forced, it still results in increased anxiety and depression. So parents report now that their own vulnerability to depression. So if you're an undocumented parent, let's say your child was born in the United States, has every right of a US citizen, you still have that stress on your mind that this could happen at any time. And that stress makes it hard for you as a parent to adjust emotionally, to be able to support your kids financially, to have a good relationship with your children, to be able to really kind of provide that structure and attachment for your child. I mean, how are you going to be involved in your child's school performance if you're just totally caught in this fear of like, anytime I get pulled over, it could be it for me and my family. And so naturally, if parents are stressed, it's going to be harder for them to be like those warm, supportive bases that the children need. So naturally, these stressors are cumulative, right? And it's intergenerational, the trauma. So I'm just again making this example of the mother may have fled trauma. She may have had her own trauma that may have pushed her into the United States. And then she has a child. And if the child then has multiple traumas, the more that they have, the worse it's going to get. So if they have one parent get deported, another parent with immigration raids, an uncle who's in detention, then the more of those experiences they have, they're cumulative, and then the risk for depression, anxiety, and PTSD is even greater. And so, I mean, I'm going to start kind of like some of this at this point is probably going to just sound duplicative but I just want to show you that there's a lot of information about anxiety, depression, attention problems, social withdrawal, etc. So we've talked a lot about the impact on kids now. And why does deportation matter? There was a study that came out in 2014 that followed people who were deported, and at least 83 were murdered shortly upon return to their country. So we think of it sometimes as, well, you can just go back to your home country and apply again if you want to, but they may not make it, you know. Other people reported being kidnapped, raped, enslaved, and sex trafficked when they returned to their country of origin. So there's a real tangible risk for some people in being deported beyond all of the family separation. So we're making pretty good time, I guess. So we have all this information, and for a lot of you, this information may have been kind of heavy. You know, we're talking about severe trauma. You know, we're talking about, and you know, those of you who have done the immigration and asylum work, you know what I mean when they're the worst stories that you've ever heard. We're talking about kids being separated. We're talking about politically charged issues. It can get us all in a very, you know, emotionally sort of compromised state. So now we transition all those feelings. We can kind of project those feelings into action. What can I actually do with these feelings such that they're not just sitting inside of me, but that in some strange, odd way, they can almost be inspiring or motivating. They can improve meaning in my life. And even though you're hearing really awful stories, they give you perspective about your own life, and it makes you feel really nice about being able to help people who are really suffering. So why should we get involved? Well, one is the Hippocratic Oath, and the other is due process. The Hippocratic Oath says, I know it's been a while for some of us. I won't call anyone out and be ageist, but for me, it's been a while. So, but when we took that oath, we said that we won't just treat a fever chart or somebody's basic labs, but we're treating a sick human being whose illness may affect their family and their economic stability, i.e. social issues. My responsibility includes these issues if I am to care adequately for the sick. So this idea that, you know, depression's better, my job is done, that's not the oath that we took. That may shift over time for individuals, and I wouldn't blame you. I know life is hard for all of us, especially now, and things come up. So, but this was the oath. And then we also remembered that we have special obligations to all fellow human beings in our society. And so for some people, the question is, well, if someone's in a detention center on US soil, is that a member of our society? So this is a very subjective thing. It definitely doesn't mean that I'm right. I would say that my personal view is that if anyone is on US soil, then I have a duty to help them. I would not feel okay with somebody dying on US soil when we could have provided them with basic medical care that could have helped them, for example. And so in the same way that we wouldn't, you know, drive by someone lying on the side of the road and not call for help, in the same way that we wouldn't, if we were on a plane and we found out someone was needing CPR, that we wouldn't go and help them. And so, but that's a very personal opinion, and I don't want to project that onto anyone else. And, you know, as physicians, boy, do people listen to you. If you write an article for your newspaper, first of all, they would be like, a doctor wants to write for us. This is fantastic. We'll take whatever you submit. Just having those initials, you've all experienced this, the MD, DO, whatever it is behind your name. You can say something so profoundly simple and people listen, and the patient could have been going to their school or going to their workplace and talking until they're blue in the face, saying the same exact thing that you're saying, and nobody listened to them, right? And so our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. You really do have a platform, And you can do it in a way where science is leading you. You're not throwing mud at a political person, but where you really have science leading you. What does the science say about brain trauma? What does the science say about parental separation? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's what we do in our asylum evaluations. Instead of saying this person, we believe them, we say, this is what trauma does to memory formation. This is what depression and anxiety do to concentration and the ability to sleep. So we know these things. Sometimes we don't know how much we know them. So, long-winded way of saying, there are a lot of ways you can get involved. You can do asylum evaluations, which is fantastic. You could get an official training from like a big national organization like Physicians for Human Rights. Our issue with Physicians for Human Rights was that they weren't able to come to the border itself because they actually are a volunteer-led organization with 2 staff. And so even though it looks really like amazing, everything they do, they actually are understaffed themselves. And so that's where Nasheen and I and so many other colleagues have been working at the border to try to actually create more infrastructure at the border. I'm noticing some chats, so I'm just wanting to make sure everyone can like still hear me and stuff. Okay, yes. So you can do that. You can go to workshops at national conferences. So I do a workshop at ACAP and APA on how to do an asylum evaluation. If you're coming to one of those conferences, sign up. And it's not the full day training like PHR, but we try to get the highlights in a half day. And then, the way that I learned and the way that Nasheen learned is individual mentorship. We found somebody who knew how to do these evaluations, and they just sat with us. They showed us their template, and they hooked us up with the local lawyers. And then that was it. The lawyers gave us a case, and we did one. For most of us, one is not enough. You do one, and you're like, I need to do that again. And then Nasheen and we proofread your evaluations. You can send them to us. We'll look over them with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that they're good to go, and we'll co-sign it with you. If you feel like, I don't know if I'm doing this right. So there are a lot of ways to get involved. But you can also perform clinical care and treatment, which all of you are experts at by definition. And you can also engage in advocacy. So more information on asylum evaluations, because we use this term like everyone knows what it means. And 5 years ago, I didn't know what this meant. So who, what, where, when, and why. Basically anybody, practically anybody who's attending this can provide an asylum evaluation. It can be any medical provider, like a physician, advanced practitioner, or nurse. It can also be any mental health provider, psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist. If you're a mental health provider, you're more likely to do a psychological forensic evaluation. And if you're like a medical provider, you're more likely to do what they call a forensic medical evaluation, which is more of a physical exam. When I do the mental health piece, I don't do more than a cursory physical. Like I document scars for sure. I document functional impairments from torture for sure. But I'm not going to have someone undress, right? So as psychiatrists, we just don't do that. But the physicians will, and they'll actually do, if someone has sexual trauma, they'll do those kind of examinations and document any scars and things like that. So by definition, if you're sitting here, you're qualified. What is it? It's basically an H&P, which you've done so many times, right? With a few modifications for court. It's just a thorough diagnostic evaluation, and Nasheen and I have a template that we use that's pretty straightforward. By the way, I'm always happy to come back and do a training. Nasheen is more than capable of doing trainings, for days, but we're here for you if you want like just more of a, how do I do this? Where do you perform these evaluations? You can perform them in the community if the person requesting asylum is in the community, undocumented, just sort of living. Or you can perform them in detention centers, and detention centers vary in how friendly they are as far as letting you in. We have actually leveraged our relationships with congressional folks like US House of Representatives, and that helps to get them to let you in. And it doesn't take much. You really just have to call the office and say, I'm a doctor and I need to get in. And if they're sympathetic, so if you know that congressional member happens to be passionate about this issue, it definitely makes it easier that way. You have to bring some, documents and stuff with you and get pre-approved. When can you do it? Well, if it's at the detention center, you kind of have to work around their hours, but if it's in the community, it can be anytime. The detention center cases are fast because you have to do it quickly before they get, their hearing. But in the community, you can usually take your time. And why should you do it? The rate of asylum, it's actually even potentially more than 50%. There's a study by Lustig et al. That showed that if you have any of these evaluations, like a physical exam or a psychological evaluation, it increases your rates of acceptance from like 20-30% to up to 80%. So it could even be like a 60% increase in the chance of getting asylum, because you have now objective evidence that this person went through something. It's a way to show damage. If we don't have this, it's their word against the immigration attorney, and the immigration attorneys and the judges are very good at making it seem like someone lied. It could be as simple as there were 6 people attacking me when they told one person, and they told another person it was 5 people. That's a lie. You're out. Something very small, they'll deport them. And so when we evaluate them and we say they meet these criteria for PTSD, if they do, we have to be objective. Then now all of a sudden it's saying that their experiences were to such an extent that it met a diagnosis. So it's just a way of sort of showing objective damage or harm. These are some of the trainings that we've been fortunate enough to do in El Paso, Brownsville, McAllen, Albuquerque. The one in El Paso on the top right actually has Veronica Escobar there. She's the congresswoman there, and she's the one that really helped us get into those detention centers. And a lot of work with Nasheen and some in Phoenix as well to try to improve this network. And the reason I moved to San Diego is to try to continue this work here. So hopefully we can just kind of make a little Southwestern network where we're sharing this information. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I think we're okay. Clinical care. So let's say you say, asylum evaluations sound great to me. There's a lot going on. I can't do it right now. Okay, fine. There are some things you can do clinically that would be super helpful. Number one, you can inquire about immigration status, but it's important how you do so. A lot of people don't inquire, but I think maybe the best way to go about it is to ask in a sensitive way. Instead of saying, are you illegal? You might see if it comes up in the social history. You might also say, hey, by the way, if you happen to have a particular documentation status, we have resources available for families, but you wouldn't push the issue naturally. Immigration status is protected under HIPAA, so you can't tell anybody, but the problem is, and you don't have to report it, so if a family tells you I'm undocumented, there's no mandate to go tell a police officer about that. But the problem is if your records get subpoenaed, that's where it could become public. And so most people will not document. Even if you ask a family if they're undocumented, you would probably not write it in your records because your records could be subpoenaed. It's just a reality of the matter. Now here's where you can really help people. Letters to the court from treating physicians are very helpful. So when I do an asylum evaluation, when Nasheen does, when one of you does an asylum evaluation, it's a forensic document, right? And so if you remember back to training, you can't be a forensic provider and a clinical provider at the same time. I can be one or the other. And so, but if you're the clinical provider, you can still submit a letter as the clinical provider that carries a lot of weight in court. So what would you write? You might write something like, this person, is claiming that they were tortured in their country of origin. This person is meeting criteria for PTSD. And then you could put in some positive citizenship things there. I mean, again, you don't make them up if you see them. Like they attend their appointments regularly, they're a part of their community, their teachers love them, they're a coach in their little league team, they work at a restaurant, they support local businesses, like whatever kind of paints that picture of them being a productive member of society. And the attorneys will go and they'll get these letters from like so many different collateral sources and kind of build that case. So if you have an adult patient who's going through this, you could still write a letter on their behalf. The other thing we can do clinically is just listen empathically. So many of you would think that I'm asking these questions and it's probably going to re-traumatize people because, they're having to go through such awful experiences. But so many times at the end, they say thank you. And I'm thinking, wow, I wasn't expecting that. You're crying, you're dissociating, you know, I feel terrible asking you these questions. And now all of a sudden you're thanking me. And it's because it may be that nobody ever listened to them empathically once in their life, you know, and so you can listen empathically and say, anyone who went through what you've been feeling would feel awful. So you're not crazy. You know, at the same time, you give credit to what they're, you know, at the same time, I can see how much it's affecting you. So you're trying to do both things. You're normalizing, but you're also taking it seriously. I think the problem with just normalizing is it makes them feel like you're diminishing their symptoms. Like, oh yeah, everyone goes through that, so it's no big deal. So we're normalizing and saying this is a typical response, but also, and I can see that it's really hard for you right now. You got to have the interpretation services. That's kind of a must. And undocumented families may have all kinds of resources depending on your environment. It's good to know what those are so you can let people know. And you can connect families to nonprofit grassroots organizations. There was the organization in Tucson, I'm forgetting their name. I know Nosheen will remember. It's the shelter for immigrants. That's a perfect example of Casa something, I think. I think Diego was our contact there. We'll get to it in a minute. So the kind of care that we want to provide to these families is tripartite. It's got to be trauma-informed because of obvious reasons. It's got to be culturally sensitive because of obvious reasons. But the multi-generational piece gets missed if we're just treating the mom and or dad, or just treating the kid in a silo. We miss that this family may have had generations and that they really need to heal together, in which case family therapy or family interventions are going to be the most important. And so I'm going to kind of skip through some of this because it's stuff that you probably know. But trauma-informed is anything from just avoiding the re-traumatization, a warm and welcoming clinical space. Culturally sensitive means seeking to understand, not making any assumption that based on someone being from somewhere that they would have any particular belief system, but really just letting them teach us about their culture and what it means to them. Highlighting shared beliefs is another way to build kind of a nice relationship. And then asking if they're experiencing discrimination. If you're planning on creating a clinical service or setting up a program geared towards immigrants, it's good for those to be in areas with a lot of where the folks are living, because that helps kind of transparency, trust of the medical system, and relationship development with local providers. And you could post flyers, you know, very tactfully, probably in the native language, just saying that we're providing care, not mentioning immigration or anything like that. And so the last thing that I'll talk about here with our 2 minutes left is our role as advocates. Now, naturally, some of you may not agree with this politically, and that's okay, you know. But if you do, there's a lot that you can do with your voice. These families cannot speak out, especially in areas where there are real consequences. I've read a number of case reports of somebody kind of, you know, protesting for immigration on a loudspeaker and saying that they're undocumented, and minutes later getting arrested. So, I mean, the consequences can be rapid for these families if they speak up. All of the major medical associations have multiple policy statements against the recent executive orders that separate immigrant children from their families and all kinds of things. You probably read about this report of immigrant women having what sounded like forced hysterectomies. We're gathering information at a national level about this, but even if it's 1% true, that's horrifying. And so it doesn't matter what part of the aisle you're on there politically, forced hysterectomy, not okay. So these are the kinds of things that we're working on nationally, but we still need help with locally getting those things out. So you can write for your local news, you can do local news interviews, and you can meet with your local representatives. These are just examples of papers that we've written. They're very easy, like 400 words. You could probably do it in an hour and they'll post it like that because you have that those credentials behind your name. You can say to a news you know, channel that we want to talk about this, and they'll come and they'll do a story, you know, and you can drive that message. You can work with your local congressional officials. So that all to say, we'll end on an inspiring note. This is a Syrian girl who made it through the war, made it across the sea. We know how many of those boats capsized, and is now healthy and developing in Germany. It may seem to you as we've talked today, okay, 67 million people. How can I make a dent in 65 million people, 67 million people? Well, if each of us sees one person, then, you know, by the end of the year, we will have seen hundreds of people. By the end of a decade, we will have seen thousands of people. And slowly, drop by drop, the jug fills. So this is a quote from Buddha, but basically it's the same idea. And that to that one drop of water, to that one person, there's nothing like the relief you get when someone looks you in the eyes and says, I will die if I go home. And you see the panic and the fear in their eyes. To know that you've given them freedom is something that none of us experience as a doctor, like actual liberty. So it's a pretty amazing feeling. Everyone can do something. So yeah, now we have about 15 minutes to answer questions and talk about next steps and how you can climb this ladder from I won't do it, I can't do it, I want to do it, how do I do it, I'll try to do it, and then at some point doing it. So I think that's about it. This is my
So
email.
will you end the screen share? Yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sidhu. I know you guys can't see me, but you will soon. So we are here and happy to field questions. I just want to say this work in this field is one of the most meaningful things I get to do as a psychiatrist. I came to this country as an immigrant at the age 12, and I'm glad I wasn't an asylum seeker, but certainly went through challenges myself. And so to be really able to play a part in supporting others as they go through what is probably much worse than any of us can imagine is really an honor. And I really appreciate Dr. Sidhu's leadership and work in this country to help support the next generation, because as we know, when children are healthy and well, it affects and impacts everyone for generations to come. So I'm looking for questions here. Would not the role of MD evaluator for ICE hearing places us at odds if we're advocates in the eye of the law?
It's a good question. I'm just scrolling through to make sure I didn't miss any questions coming through. Okay, so.
While you're looking at those, I'll just announce that our next Arizona asylum training is actually scheduled for November 21st. And both Dr. Sidhu and I will be there and would love to have all of you, anyone who's interested. It's going to be on Zoom 8 to 4. And it is held through the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona. And nurse practitioners, allied health professionals, medical students, residents, fellows, all welcome. And if you can just send me your interest, I will add you to the Psych Asylum listserv that we have here in Arizona. And as soon as the link for registration for the November 21st event becomes available, that will be sent out to that listserv. So feel free to stay in touch while we work in those logistics.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjabar. Dr. Sidhu, I did want to let you know that I have one question in the Q&A box. I have a couple to call out to you as well that you have seen in the chat. The first one is, these people do not have the right to an attorney. Is that so? So do they have any other options than volunteer lawyers?
Yeah, and I do see the question in the chat box from Dr. Bastani, so I will get to that. So very good question about so yes, it's an odd thing, right? If you're a criminal in the United States, well, that's even like in quotes, but like let's say that you're somebody who murdered somebody, for whatever reason, you have a right to an attorney in the United States. But if you cross into the United States and you have never committed a crime, you have no right to an attorney, and the government will not provide an attorney to you. So you have a few options. If you somehow have money, you can hire, most people just come with, the shirt on their back. you can somehow hire an attorney. You know, the kinds of, the immigration attorneys do a fantastic job. I think for defense attorneys, it depends on how invested they are in their clients. If it's a standard defense attorney. So the immigration attorneys oftentimes will do these screenings at the detention centers and identify clients who have a strong case ultimately. The unfortunate part is that the vast majority don't have an attorney. And so some of the organizations in Arizona, now I'm blanking on all of these names because it's been a while since I've been there, but some of the legal groups in Arizona, for this reason, they actually don't see clients, but what they do is they do mass education. So rather than say, I'm going to help this one client with their case, they say, I'm going to talk to hundreds of people about these are your rights, and this is how you can best represent yourself in court. And so, yeah, I mean, that doesn't give us the opportunity to do an asylum evaluation, but it's super valuable. Some experienced forensic evaluators like Noshin and I could actually probably take on a case without an attorney. And there are some groups that I'm working with in Mexico where I may need to do that because because of the Remain in Mexico policy, there are people who would normally have met criteria, but they're not even being allowed to get to the border to ask for asylum. And so some of the immigration groups have set up offices on the other side where they're screening. And if they have a client where it's like, okay, we've got the scars on the body, like compelling story, then with some of those organizations, I've talked about whether I could maybe work with them without an attorney. But that's not a place to start probably.
So Dr. Sidhu, yeah, moving on to Dr. Bastani's question then, would not the role of MD evaluator for ICE hearing place a psychiatrist at odds if they're advocates in the eye of the law?
Yes, potentially. So it's only come up a few times, and I think it depends on how you advocate. So I've heard of, it's never happened to me, and I'm probably at about, I don't know, 50 or so evaluations. I'm not sure. I haven't counted them each one by one. So that's never come up, and I'm, you know, if you Googled me, you'd probably find stuff. But I have some colleagues who work with more conservative courts who have actually said that people have read their Twitter posts or whatever.
Okay.
So, but I think it depends on how you advocate, because if you advocate based on science, you always have a defense. What is the judge going to say if you cited an article? That you're a radical leftist? I mean, it's a scientific article. If you say this awful administration is so bad and this is terrible and I hate them, and you know, like, then of course it's going to seem like you're a biased evaluator. So you could certainly make the argument that if you've written on this topic and you've spoken on it scientifically, that actually makes you more of an expert. But yes, I mean, you can get into, this is some of the sparring. I would say it's the vast minority. If I were to look at like not doing advocacy versus doing it, I think the benefits of doing advocacy far outweigh the low likelihood and minimal risk that it would pose by doing the advocacy, as long as you're smart about how you advocate.
I have a couple more questions. I think people are really enjoying this presentation. Dr. Schulte says, do you support ACLU fighting these injustices?
I mean, that's a broad kind of statement, yeah. But you know, sure. But then we have to be willing to support, if we really want, you know, freedom of speech, we have to be willing to support it for everybody, and not just when we like what they're saying and all those things. But ACLU is an interesting group, right? Because they're for freedom of speech. So if white supremacists want freedom of speech, the ACLU will represent them. So it's the kind of those shared values, I guess. But I think they're an interesting group to follow.
From Dr. Chatwal, what are the differences in child evaluations and adult evaluations?
Very good question. So it's going to take you 2 to 3 times as long, depending on the age of the child. The younger, the longer. The preschool and middle school age type children, you might get even more from like a play therapy type. They're more likely to show the trauma in reenactment and play and kind of imagination, maybe dreams, then they're going to be able to give you a clear cut, naturally, right? Preschoolers aren't that way anyways, but the closer you get to being a teenager, the more you can start to get, you know, an adult-like interview. So the child interviews are a little bit more intensive that way, but I think they're still very doable.
I have a comment combination question that's in the chat, and attendees will be sure to not miss your question if you type it in the Q&A. We are trying to monitor the chat as well. So from Dr. Darwin Shern, I have, thank you for advocating for the powerless and the vulnerable. As an immigrant myself who was lucky enough to have the opportunity to move through the regular process, which is already difficult, I can imagine the immense work you do to help people trying to escape prosecution for various reasons in their countries. Do you have programs that take on helping these asylees assimilate with the American society?
I don't know. Nashin's saying yes. Let's go with Nashin.
So a couple of programs. One is the International Rescue Committee, and part of what they do is oversee this process, but also they have volunteers, and you can volunteer for them to help with the next steps of these individuals as they get settled into the system. Another organization that I work closely with is called the Tahirih Justice Center that's based in DC, but now in other states and cities as well. And they also have a network of community resources for people who have are going through the asylum process and then get through the asylum process and are actually needing all the different services from healthcare to advocacy to English learning, et cetera, to really help them assimilate. So there are organizations out there, and feel free to be part of our listserv and network, and we're happy to answer those questions.
And I think we're catching up here on the chat and the questions, Dr. Sidhu, but I know incoming President Dr. Dawn joined us this morning, and our fellow panelists can't submit through the Q&A, so I just want to make sure if she had any question for you that she wanted us to bring forward.
Yes, there are also some really innovative videos that a really good friend of mine, Dr. Adam from Missouri, has created in 8 different languages. They're animated, they're really neat animated videos that actually will kind of show like a family going through war, and then like to destigmatize, there for the families to know what the typical symptoms are to trauma. And then they kind of have this, they're really beautifully made, like, you know, you see the kid with sort of dark clouds around their head and kind of going through bullying and stuff. And after the mental health treatment, you see, like, you know, the sun starts shining again and the birds come out, and it's really an uplifting, and they're maybe 5 minutes. So she's been using those. They're listed on the ACAP webpage, and she's also just been using those a lot locally in the schools. So those are another, I mean, they're a brief kind of nice thing to do with families. But thank you, Nashin, for, I didn't know about Tahirih, so that's good to know.
I'll also just mention that even though I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so far most of the evaluations I've been doing are for adults seeking asylum. So a lot of times they're the parents of these kids. And so there are many ways to serve regardless of your education or the population that you're most comfortable serving. We have a lot of trans people crossing the border and awaiting asylum evaluation processes. And one of the most joyous aspects of this is when you get that email from the attorney a year later saying, remember this case you did a year ago? They just received asylum, and here's a video to see, you know, what happened to them and how they're doing now. And it's truly inspiring to know that something you did a long time ago actually made a difference in somebody's life.
No Mas Mortis is the other one, right? Where you just, Nashin, you would do a better job of explaining that than I could probably.
No, I wouldn't. Go for it.
So my understanding, it sounds like they're just an incredible organization that's based in Tucson, right? Where they thousands of people have died crossing the border, and it's a really eerie. They actually have a graph that they'll show up with all these tiny, tiny red dots of just dead bodies that they found, and it's just lit up across the kind of southern Arizona border. Is that the Tohono O'odham reservation?
Mhm.
Yeah, and so so what this No Mas Mortes organization does is they will find areas that are more likely to be crossed, and they will drop care packages off just in the middle of the desert that include water, food, I can't remember what else, maybe some basic first aid stuff. And
And
they've
we
had some doctors even sort of try to help people that they find with these makeshift kind of, hospital is not the right word, like a tent that they could use to provide medical care. And so, I mean, you might just go out and drop some water off somewhere.
There are several undergraduate and medical students who are part of this No Mas Muertes, No More Deaths organization, and they are super active. It's amazing to see what they do. There was a medical student at the University of Connecticut who was taking a year off just to come to Arizona to help with the asylum process and No Mas Muerte. And just, it's amazing to see young people really being out in the community, even within their medical training, to get experience of what it's like to be out in the fields. And they cross the border and go to Mexico, and there are tents there, and they serve the people. They call the attending on this side and say, I just evaluated so-and-so, and their blood pressure is this, what should I do? So there's a whole network of physicians in family medicine, internal medicine, and psychiatry who are involved in kind of supporting these processes. And I'm also seeing a question from Heather, how do you find interpreters? So that's one of the beauties of being part of a university system. So we have medical students and undergrads who volunteer to interpret. And a lot of times the attorney who is either the attorney for the Florence Immigration Project or the International Rescue Committee who is in charge of the case, they will also have access to volunteer or paid interpreters as part of those organizations. So it's not usually a problem finding an interpreter.
And did we, in our other conversations, Dr. Ranjabar answer Dr. Shadwell's question about adult psychiatrists being able to do child evaluations?
I think it's really depending on people's comfort levels. So, I would say that as a child psychiatrist, I've done one child evaluation. All the evaluations I'm doing are for adults because the need is so much greater on the adult side right now. But I think to know people that are interested in doing the evaluations and go through the training, it's really up to the practitioner if they're comfortable evaluating a child. But so far the need really has been, at least in Arizona that I'm aware of, much more for the adults.
So we're a little bit into our break time, so I want to respect Dr. Sidhu's time and give everyone a chance to stretch and
Terry, I just want to say a couple things just real quick. I don't want to cut into the break time, but just real quickly, that was a superb presentation. It really was. Very humbling too, and it just speaks to we human beings have kind of made a mess of things here, and it can even be overwhelming. You just think, oh my God, it's just so much. But to the point that Dr. Sidhu made about, one drop, all it takes is one person doing one thing. And it's just so important just to go do something, like a bottle of water to someone, even here for the homeless people, whatever it is. It's just so good to do something. And what you find, it's not only, doing a good thing, I think, but you get so much back in return. The person doing the thing usually gets more than the person receiving it. And the other thing I just want to say real quickly is I really appreciate the tone of respectfulness and, consideration of all people, not just some. And I think one of the things we as psychiatrists really can do is set an example for the people around us, our families, our communities, and everyone by just being good people and treating everyone with respect and consideration and love. And it that says volumes. It says a heck of a lot more than the words we say and everything else. So I just encourage you all to think about that and do that. So that was it, Terry. Thanks.
Thank you.
Terry, may I say something real quick?
Absolutely.
I want to thank Dr. Sidhu. I've had the privilege of hearing him at the ACAP assembly, and so inspiring to hear you again. Every time I hear you speak, I gain something more from it. And I've kind of, on a personal level, I'm an immigrant too. I'm fortunate enough to be an English speaker from my country of origin, and that certainly helped with assimilation. But I feel for immigrants who haven't had that benefit and who are struggling, of course, with the legal issues as well as kind of the cultural assimilation. Your slide that you shared with the steps and moving towards the, I want to do something, I can't, I don't know how, I will, I'm trying, I've done it. That really resonated with me. And unlike Nosheen and the support that she has received from being in an educational institution, being in private practice, I obviously don't feel that same comfort level, but the fact that now there's a training next month that's virtual is making me feel like it'll be a lot easier to take that, that first step and put my toe in the water of trying to get involved with this. So I thank you for the knowledge that you shared. I thank you for the work that you do, the support that you give to the immigrants, and just for sharing your breadth of knowledge with us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And this really is a one-on-one relationship. And so the nice thing about that is you can cut out all of the other things that you have to jump through at a university typically, and you can just come straight to Nosheen, straight to me, and I'll read that evaluation and we'll edit it with you, and you won't be alone on it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sidhu, and thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. It's terrific.
So attendees will leave this webinar window open. We'll be on break. We're just going to play some relaxing music. Feel free to jump in and out of our educational sessions all throughout the day. We appreciate this chance to connect with you.